Today's episode is a free preview of our sister podcast, To Save Us From Hell. This is the only independent podcast about the United Nations. Co-host Anjali, Dayal, and I are bona fide UN experts. I've covered the UN as a journalist for nearly 20 years. Anjali is a professor of international relations at Fordham University who teaches and researches and studies the UN. And with our powers combined, we bring you insights and analysis about all things United Nations that you simply can't find elsewhere. Full episodes of To Save Us From Hell are available exclusively to paying subscribers. You can get a subscription via globaldispatches.org following the links in the show notes of this episode, or if you're listening directly in Apple Podcasts, you can unlock a subscription in-app. What we're doing with this show is truly unique, and I hope that you will help us keep this show alive and sustain our coverage of the United Nations. Enjoy the episode.
We should recognize that what we will be seeing are human disasters that are exacerbated by a lack of willingness to expend the money and political capital to help people.
Welcome to Save Us From Hell, a podcast about the United Nations. I am your co-host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I'm a longtime journalist who's covered the UN since about 2005.
And I'm Anjali Dayal. I'm an associate professor of international politics at Fordham University, where I teach and I do research and I write about the United Nations.
And as always, To Save Us From Hell is a project of Global Dispatches. To access the full version of this episode, please go to globaldispatches.org and get a paying subscription. This very podcast is a premium offering for our paid subscribers, and a huge thank you to our paid subscribers to enable us to keep doing what we're doing. This has been a fun chat show we started a few months ago, Anjali. I've been enjoying this.
Yeah, it's coming up on 10 months.
And throughout those 10 months, the world has collapsed around us. The United Nations is on the verge of unprecedented challenges, of which we've unpacked and will continue to unpack.
That's right.
And one of the key challenges that we will be discussing this week is what happens to the United Nations when it has to lay off thousands and thousands of employees because funding is cut on account of the United States foreign aid freeze and the shuttering of USAID. And we are seeing some immediate impacts of that over the last just couple of days, Anjali.
Yeah. We're going to talk about these in turn, but in particular, we've seen announcements from UNDSS, the United Nations Department of Safety and Security. We've seen announcements from UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, and we've seen announcements from IOM, the International Organization for Migration.
So let's go through each of those announcements and each of those institutions, maybe one by one, because surely there are other institutions that are similarly on the chopping block that probably will have to lay off a good number of employees. And we're talking about in the thousands here, and we're talking about the agencies that we just discussed. But surely there are more to come. So I think for the purposes of our conversation today, let's just kind of talk through each of those, explain the significance of these cuts and what it portends for other cuts potentially facing other organizations. So maybe, Anjali, let's start with IOM, the International Organization for Migration, which as of now is facing the steepest cuts thus far. So over the last several weeks, and really just in the last couple of days, we've seen a compounding number of announcements from IOM, which incidentally is led by an American named Amy Pope, who's a former Biden and Obama administration official, who they're just laying off staff by the thousands. And this is a direct consequence of cuts imposed by the Trump administration. The first big tranche of staff laid off were staff at IOM working at the U.S. Refugee Assistance Program. Essentially, this is a State Department-funded program that helps vet refugees that are making their way to the United States for resettlement. And IOM announced pink slips for something like 3,000 staff working on this program, a massive number.
And by their own statement last week, I believe, they noted that this is something that they're doing reluctantly, This is something that we see echo in the other statements that have been released by organizations, but they're not framing it as they did in the first Trump administration, for example, as an opportunity to enact reform. They are very clearly saying this is not something we want to do. This is not necessary reform. This is austerity. This is austerity because we have no funding. And as they note in their statement, and I quote, quite simply, IOM staff represent the best of public service. We are deeply sorry to lose them. They also note that this is, a problem that, as you said, is not simply one that we measure in terms of the loss of job and the loss of the impact that those jobs make on the most vulnerable communities in the world.
Yeah, and to that end, it's maybe worth unpacking what the U.S. Refugee Assistance Program is and does. So essentially, you have millions of refugees around the world. By far, the vast majority of these refugees will flee across a border, flee from violence or some disaster somewhere, and remain in a hosting community or a refugee camp across some international border. This is where most refugees, by far, most refugees will end up. Some will be able to be integrated into those host communities, into those host countries. Some will be able to return home at some point when the disaster fades. But there's like a relatively small number of people for whom remaining in place is just not an option. And these people are eligible for third-party repatriation. Basically, they are able to go to a country far from where they are at the moment to become resettled refugees. And essentially what happens is the UN Refugee Agency will kind of take first pass at identifying people who would qualify for this third country resettlement, pass their names on to IOM, who through this US funded program will vet them like very thoroughly and see if indeed they qualify for resettlement, then help manage their resettlement to the United States. However, under the Trump administration, we're not doing refugee resettlement.
Yeah.
Last year, there was about like 120,000 or so people who were eligible for resettlement into the United States through this program. This year, I can't imagine there's very many at all. And that's a consequence of, the policy decision. We're not going to accept refugees, but also enacting that policy decision, just flatlining the U.S. Refugee Assistance Program.
The U.S. resettlement program used to be a gold standard in the world. Like prior to the first Trump administration, even though for good reason, there has been critique of the bipartisan policies that succeeding U.S. administrations have adopted towards the border. The broader system of U.S. resettlement programs used to be among the best in the world. And so when we say it's dropped dramatically, one of the things that we're noting is that one of the best equipped programs in the world is simply not doing this anymore. That isn't to say that this was one of the programs that resettled the most refugees. Most refugees end up in neighboring countries. But this resettlement program was an extraordinary tool of vetting and assistance.
Mm-hmm. And like big picture, the US and other Western countries do this refugee resettlement program in part as like a demonstration of solidarity, right? You have like the vast number of refugees fleeing the conflict in Sudan, for example, are over the border in Chad. And the idea that you would have Western countries, the United States chief among them, as being able to accept some small number of people who are just unable to stay in Chad or unable to go back home across the border to Sudan, to Darfur. It just provides this demonstration that, yes, I know you, the frontline country, are bearing the brunt of the burden, but we're also there to help.
It's also worth noting that, per the IOM's own statement on this, the global structural adjustments that they have to undertake will have global consequences. This is a 30% reduction in estimated donor funding for the year, including via, as you said at the beginning, a major decrease from the US funded projects. But 30% isn't just going to be isolated to what the US is doing.
And to that end, it was announced, we're recording this on March 24th, just a couple days ago, IOM sent out an announcement that they're going to have to reduce their headquarters staff by about 20%. So there's only like 1,000. It's not like a huge agency.
Yeah.
Most of the agency's work is not in headquarters. It's out in, I'm using air quotes, the field. It's in places where people are, but, they still have logistical backstopping that's required in Geneva. And so IOM is cutting their headquarters staff by about like 250 people of a total staff of 1,000. So these cuts are having an impact on the very functioning of these agencies.
And, these are not going to be like third senior executive vice president for paperclips or something, right? Because that's not the way these organizations run. They have comparatively small staff in comparison to their global projection.
Yeah. So the next agency that's kind of on the chopping block, again, because it receives a huge proportion of its funding from the United States, is the UN Refugee Agency. Anjali, do you want to just like maybe give us a big picture description of what UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, does and is and how it works?
So, refugee resettlement at the end of World War II ends up being a really critical part of reconstruction. It's sort of initially a military endeavor led by the Allied powers and the US, but single states are not ideally positioned to do this kind of work worldwide. And once the sort of like initial military stage ends, we end up with two sets of organizations. First, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency in 1943, and then the United Nations Refugee Organization in 1946. And that's when we end up with the sort of predecessor to what is today's UNHCR. One of these things that emerges out of this time is that we start distinguishing between refugees and displaced persons. Refugees are displaced persons, as you said initially, right? They're assumed to have somewhere to go where they cannot currently be. Refugees, on the other hand, are assumed to be people who no longer can return where they came from and who need to go somewhere else. And this establishes basically a hierarchy of repatriation, right? First, refugees have to be resettled, then displaced persons later can potentially be returned where they came from or found somewhere else. And that initial push is incredibly successful. There are 30 million displaced people in Europe from 1939 to 1943. And by the end of 1951, there are only about 170,000 people who are still refugees in continental Europe. And so UNHCR in 1951 emerges as an incredibly valuable agency, one that's looked upon as being valuable and up to the task of doing this kind of work worldwide by the UN General Assembly. And it's an agency that's sort of mandated to lead and coordinate international action to protect refugees and resolve refugee programs worldwide. It does the work of certifying who is and isn't a refugee at the international level, and it's charged with safeguarding the rights and the well-being of refugees. Now, today, in the popular imagination, we often sort of imagine a refugee camp with the UNHCR logo on it as being the signature work of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, but its purpose is political in many ways. It's to help establish the difference between someone who can't go home, who needs a new home, and someone who eventually could be returned home. It's also a frontline working agency in that way. It does the actual work, not the political coordination among member states, but it does the actual work.
And to that end, Filippo Grandi, who's an Italian national, who's the head of the UN Refugee Agency right now, he is the High Commissioner to which the UN High Commission of Refugees refers, said in a statement facing these cuts that, look, something like 90% of their staff are out in the world. They're not at headquarters. They are out doing the work of refugee protection, running camps, supporting host communities as well, because, I don't know the proportion on the top of my head, but most refugees don't live in like kind of UNHCR camps.
Yeah.
They are in host communities and are supported by UNHCR in those host communities, as is the host community themselves, because you don't want to be in a situation where people in a village who the only ones getting relief are those who fled from across the border. You want to help the entire village. And so the way in which UNHCR is funded, it is funded like other UN humanitarian agencies, which is to say that it is looked at kind of like a charity. And the largest donors are member states of the United Nations, chief among them the United States. And again, like IOM, the UN Refugee Agency is facing massive budget cuts. Earlier this year, they imposed like a hiring freeze. They prevented most like staff travel to cut down costs. But those cost saving measures are now kind of still catching up to them. And Grandi announced that they are going to have to consider mass layoffs at the organization.
And he said it was something like as many as 5,000 to 6,000 workers. And he notes like this is important work that they simply cannot afford to continue. So, underlining again the idea that what they're getting rid of is not like excess. The measurable impact of these cuts will be in frontline work that simply cannot afford to be done anymore, which means it is not just the loss of jobs that's the problem, but the loss of services to, again, the most vulnerable people in the world.
And again, this is a direct consequence of the Trump administration's targeting of these two agencies because they deal with two issues that the Trump administration has like a high degree of animus towards, international migration and refugees. And this is like a longstanding thing, but now we're seeing the downstream consequences of this. And I guess like again, like big picture question to you, Anjali, like what does it mean to live in a world in which the UN Refugee Agency, which is already taxed beyond its capacity, is having that capacity shrink even further? All the while, I should note that the scale of refugee movements is increasing.
Yeah.
Conflicts are lasting longer. Climate change is causing more and more natural disasters that are causing people to flee across border. You have a new issue of climate refugees. Meanwhile, because these conflicts are lasting longer than they used to, the average time that someone spends in a refugee camp is now something like 20 years. Because there's no big picture political support for ending conflicts these days, you have these crises continue to fester and fester. And all the while, we're having this major cut to the one agency that deals with the outcome of these festering conflicts.
That's right. I mean, the numbers are staggering. In 2015, right before Trump's last trip to the White House, at a time when people were talking across North America and Europe about the refugee crisis, largely as the result of crises in Syria and Sudan, but not exclusively. The UNHCR mandate covered about 57 million people in 2015. That was up from 21 million people in 2007. Today, in 2024, that number is up to 122.6 million people worldwide who are forcibly displaced, who fall in one way or another underneath the UN High Commission for Refugees umbrella. That is just an astounding number of people. 43.7 million of those people have been designated as refugees. That requires a political process, a set of aid and assistance programs, a set of capacity building programs that depends not just on money, but on political will and the interplay between the two. And UNHCR is facing a situation where they do not have either the money or the political will to do this work in a way where, as you noted, right, they were already stretched well beyond capacity. 122.6 million people forcibly displaced at the end of June 2024, in a world where in 2007, only 21 million people fell under the refugee umbrella. That's an extraordinary amount of work.
And in, like, say, other circumstances, a drawdown of U.S. support for these agencies would be slow, gradual, and deliberate. But this is like a sudden cutoff, which is throwing these agencies and UHCR in potential, chaos and catastrophe. And I know we've discussed this before, but like the suddenness of this shutdown is leaving a big hole that other countries just can't fill, for the fact that the US has historically been the largest contributor to international refugee support. I mean, you do have other donors out there, and they might be willing to add support, but nothing at the scale of what the US can provide, and nothing as swiftly as is required in these circumstances.
That's right. And it's worth noting, right, that per UNHCR's own statistics, about 71% of forcibly displaced people are housed in middle and low income countries. And so, per the earlier part of our discussion, what wealthy Western countries are doing is providing goodwill when they either accept what is, at the end of the day, a negligible number of refugees and fund the effort. They're essentially saying, look, we understand that this is a global problem, and you are accepting much of the cost locally of people. And I want to be clear that when we talk about the cost, right, we mean the literal cost. The idea that refugees are people who deserve to be safe, politically accepted, and welcomed, we're taking as a given. There are real political concerns associated for partisan actors with it. But if we're thinking like as people who believe this mission is important, the cost that we're talking about is literal.
Yeah.
These are not countries that can easily afford to absorb that many additional people. And so when wealthy Western countries back off from funding and providing political will to it, they don't stop the flow of desperate people. What they do is stop helping address the flow of desperate people.
And I just want to go back to one point. You mentioned kind of like the negligible number in the big picture of people who are resettled. I mean, obviously, it's a very, very consequential and important for each individual who is resettled or are resettled to a third country. But in the U.S. context, didn't you say earlier something like 100 million people are under UNHCR care right now?
Right now, it's 122.6 million people were forcibly displaced. 32 million refugees fall under UNHCR's mandate.
So of those 32 million refugees under UNHCR's mandate, a little over 100,000 ended up in the United States last year.
Right.
So we are talking about a small percentage of the big problem in terms of refugee resettlement. But then there's, of course, the whole issue of supporting refugees in their host countries, which is going to be much, much harder now that the United States is shutting down funding.
And I think it's also worth noting, right, that it is the case that it's U.S. decision at this moment that is putting everyone in great peril, but other countries have not fallen over themselves to cover themselves in glory on this either, right? We are in this situation of vast underfunding because this is not a popular political question for most wealthy countries.
Mm-hmm.
In that last big surge, the 2015, 2016 surge, alone among wealthy European countries, Germany stepped up to fund and accept and resettle refugees. Other countries, not so much.
And maybe it's just like a quick digression to give a bit of kudos to Justin Trudeau,
Yes.
who, it was towards the end of his political career in Canada, which lasted 10 years, which is a very, very long time for any political career. It was kind of like hip to dunk on Trudeau. And, I get a lot of the criticisms, but to his enduring credit, in 2015, in the height of the Syria refugee crisis, where you saw those horrible images of Aylan Kurdi, the 3-year-old boy washing up on a Greek shore, and you had a real panic in the United States and mostly in Europe over Syrian refugees in the context of a really hotly contested political race in Canada. Trudeau decided to lean into accepting refugees. He campaigned on Canada being an accepting and welcoming place to refugees, and he won that election. He won that election handily. And so it's just kind of, as a digression, always good to see a politician taking a political risk on doing the right thing and it being rewarded. So Canada, frankly, has been a leader in refugee resettlement in a number of ways.
I was thinking about Europe, but I should have mentioned Canada because European reactions in the broad sense to that crisis were sort of egregious.
Mm-hmm.
And Germany stood out as distinguishing themselves in that case. But Canada has been consistently and notably at the forefront of this issue as well, and deserve all the credit for that.
So on the UN Refugee Agency and its ability to carry out its mandates around the world, like what do you see as like the near-term and long-term implications of these cost-saving measures that are going to have to be imposed?
This is the empirical problem the crisis and the disaster that are befalling people that are making it impossible for them to stay at home or return home, those are not going away. As you noted, the political factors that might make it possible for those situations to be resolved just don't exist right now. And as a result, what we should expect to see is increasing.
That was a free preview of our full episode. To unlock the episode, please go to globaldispatches.org and purchase a subscription. We rely on your support to keep this show going. Thank you. Thank you for listening to Save Us From Hell. The show is co-hosted by me, Mark Leon Goldberg, and Anjali Dayal. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. Our cover art is by Sarah D. Michelle. If you've not already done so, please subscribe to our show via Substack at globaldispatches.org. We are sustaining this show by selling subscriptions to it via Substack. You can get a discounted subscription by going to globaldispatches.org/save us. You can follow the link in the show notes as well. And finally, if you'd like to discuss this episode with us, please visit globaldispatches.org and click on chat, where we'll be around to discuss what we discussed in this episode. Thanks, and be sure to tell friends and colleagues about To Save Us From Hell, a new podcast about the United Nations.